Salim Mansur is an associate professor of political science at the University of Western Ontario. He's also a columnist for Sun Media and the author of Islam's Predicament, Perspectives of a Dissident Muslim, and most recently, Delectable Lie, a liberal repudiation of multiculturalism. I talked with Salim in his office at the University of Western Ontario. As a political scientist, an author, a columnist, you've been called Canada's angriest moderate. Robert Fulford said that in the National Post. How do you respond to such a description, and is it accurate?
Robert Fulford is a person I know. I can call him a friend. I think he was using those words, angriest moderate, in tongue-in-cheek manner.
Because you don't come across to me as angry at all.
I hope so. People who know me know that I'm not an angry person. I have very firm position, and I defend those positions, and I've articulated those positions very firmly. But I'm not an angry person. There's no reason to be angry. And so the juxtaposition of angriest moderate, that too is in some way paradoxical or oxymoron. But I think it was a tongue-in-cheek sort of a headline for a column that he did on me.
But you are a moderate, though you call yourself a dissident Muslim.
I don't like the term moderate. I think moderate is a term that has come about in the current circumstances of the post 9/11 world somehow to distinguish those Muslims who are not supportive, or in some ways who decline or deny the role of the Islamists in the Muslim world and in the West. For me, to be a Muslim, to be an Islamist, to be moderate. So it is, again, a redundant statement. And so I prefer the term dissident Muslim. That is, I am a person who's questioning, in the deepest sense, where the Muslim world has been headed, and in particular, during my lifetime.
Now, you've just come back from Morocco and Algeria. What is your impression of the so-called Arab Spring?
It's quite right. It is so-called Arab Spring. There is a lot of unrest, and there is very good reason for these unrests, for the state of agitation that exists across North Africa and in the Middle East, and in places as we are following it, there is very deep-seated conflict taking place, and there are very good reasons for it. But the overall reality, and I think I wrote a column about this on return. Actually, I filed it from Algeria. It was interesting. I was there on the week that the Algerians were marking, and there was not much hoopla around it, but at least they were marking the 50th anniversary of Algeria's independence, that is, the end of the war with the French and Algeria becoming an independent country. And I wrote a column after that looking at these 50 years and making an assessment, the wretched of the earth, that was the term that Fanon had used. Fanon had gone to Algeria, Frantz Fanon. He died in Algeria. He was a Frenchman from Martinique, a black man who supported the Algerian war, and basically the struggle of the black man or the colonized people against European colonialism, and he called them the wretched of the earth, and it was a celebration, his book, of the wretched of the earth and the justification of violence by the wretched of the earth against their colonial masters. So I turned it around and I said, what would Fanon think if he came back 50 years later? The wretched of the earth are in more miserable situation. Colonialism has ended. The French have gone back, as have the British and others in all of Africa and other parts. And the situation in the last 50 years have gotten worse, not better. And this is something serious to think about and talk about. And all of these societies are, in one form or another, dictatorships. There's an absence of freedom. There's a complete lack of respect for individual rights. And so people cannot discuss this. So in that sense, what is the Arab Spring, which is a misnomer, it is so-called, it is in a sense a demonstration of a people that have been suffocated and oppressed by their own elite, who have risen up against that elite. Of course, some of the governments have toppled. We are seeing now what's happening in Syria. And there's a whole other subject matter of assessing where, after toppling these dictators like Gaddafi or Hosni Mubarak, Bashar Assad may be going soon, the Tunisian dictator, after toppling them, what comes next? That's a huge subject in itself, because the people who are coming into power or going to assume power are no better than the dictators whom the people have overthrown.
Now, I think you may have planned to go into Tunisia. Now, Tunisia, of course, was where some say the Arab Spring, so-called, began with the self-immolation of Mohamed Bouazizi.
Mohamed Bouazizi, that's correct.
And you decided not to go to Tunisia?
Well,
Why is that?
I was told by friends, I was at the borders, I was very close, and I did want to go in, and I was told in no uncertain term that I shouldn't risk myself going in, because I don't speak the language, and the situations are very uncertain. And so I thought, the old saying, what is it? It goes like, discretion is the better part of valor.
Yes.
So I stepped back.
Could it be because of your views itself, not just your...
That's
that you would
true,
be
too.
obviously a foreigner,
That's true.
but your views as well.
That's true.
Now, your views here in London, Ontario, have basically made you an outcast in the Muslim community here. You've sort of been ostracized, have you? You can't attend mosque because there is nobody there who, as you said before, would speak with you, would discuss with you. Is that still the case?
Yeah, that's the case. Again, that's also part of my discretion, is the better part of valor. I know that if I walk in, there are 2 mosques in London, as you know, and if I walk into either of those 2 mosques, that I might have to pay a bitter price.
Such as?
Because I am identified as a person who has questioned, challenged, and talked about and written about things which the people in the mosque and the post people in the mosque who control the mosque believe that I have crossed the boundary and I am more or less an apostate from Islam. So to be a dissident Muslim, to the people who are practicing quote-unquote official Islam, as the people in the mosque do, a dissident Muslim becomes an apostate.
Are you fearing for your safety?
I don't any longer, but I remain cautious about it. I don't want to wave a red flag in front of a bull, as they say, So going into the mosque would be waving a red flag in front of the bull. But it is a publicly known fact, and it has been in the public domain, that people from the mosque have written vicious letters about me in the media, and have officially declared that they have nothing to do with me and I don't have anything to do with them. And that's true. I'm an individual person. I'm an individual Muslim. I don't belong to any party, and the mosque is a party. Islamism is a party. It's a party ideology. These are the people who have reduced Islam into a political ideology. They have sucked the religion out of what is its spiritual core and replaced it with politics, all in the guise of religion.
What does that say about the leadership, if not the membership, of the Muslim mosques here in London, in Canada?
It says that they support it. Mind you, all Muslims, London...
Support Islamization.
Islamism. The mosques support Islamism. There's no question about that. In fact, all the mosques, maybe 90% of the mosques in Canada, one would have to search hard to find if there is a mosque that is opposed to Islamism, opposed to Muslim Brotherhood, opposed to what is happening in the Muslim world, that is the official Islam. It would be hard to find one, because all of these mosques are, in one way or the other, funded by offshore money coming from places which are the breeding ground of Islamist terrorism. Saudi Arabia, Iran, Wahhabism.
Muslim Brotherhood, do you think there's a link there as well?
Well, Muslim Brotherhood is a creature of that.
Mm-hmm.
It is part and parcel of it. So I don't go to these mosques.
How does that make you feel, just personally?
Liberated.
Liberated?
Yeah, absolutely, because one can speak freely and openly. It is as Groucho Marx said. Remember his famous saying,
yes,
that if some party wants me, or club wants to give me a membership, I would run away from it.
Yes.
It's precisely to maintain one's freedom, and then that's what it is.
Well, that's a very healthy and unexpected response, I have to say. Now, you were born in Calcutta, India. And could you take us through your journey from a boy in Calcutta to where you are today as an associate professor of political science in Canada. What was that journey like?
In 90 seconds?
No, take all the time you need. All the time you need.
Yeah, I was born in Calcutta. I'm not a Midnight's Children that Salman Rushdie referred to in his book, Midnight's Children, which is, by the way, a marvelous book. If you haven't read it, I would recommend that at some point you might want to read it. Midnight's Children are those referring to those who were born on the eve of or on the hour of the independence of modern India from Britain, which was August of 1947. So I'm not a Midnight's Children. I was born several years later, but I was born in Calcutta, which was Calcutta is the city that was the home of my family for generation, both on my side of my parents, by my father and my mother. But my father, who had joined the Bengal Civil Service, Calcutta was the capital not only at one time of British India, but is also the capital of the province of Bengal, undivided Bengal during the British period. And during the war years, 1939-1945, my father had joined the British Civil Service, the Bengal Civil Service. He couldn't join the forces because he was not physically fit. There were other members of my family who went to the services. They joined the Royal Indian Air Force, the Royal Indian Navy, and the military, but my father didn't. My father joined the civil service. He worked in the civil service, and then comes 1947, and many people, my father being one of them, and the extended family, my uncles and aunts and everybody else, they had to make the critical decision. Where would they be? Where would they go? The circumstances in Calcutta was the ground zero of the breakup of India, and it was a place of immense violence. Those people who have seen the movie Gandhi can recall the snapshot. There was tremendous violence in Calcutta, in Bengal, and also in Punjab, Lahore, the other side of India. But in Calcutta, and people had to decide. And it so happened my father decided that he would move to Pakistan.
How old were you then?
I wasn't born then.
I see.
This is 1947.
Mm-hmm.
And he moved to Pakistan. But my mother, because situations were very uncertain and fluid, remained in Calcutta and then kept going back and forth because that was her parents' home. The situation being in the country, both sides was very fluid in those days. And so when my time came to enter into this world, my mother went back to Calcutta, and I was born in Calcutta, and I had my early years in Calcutta, and then I would be moving back and forth between my grandparents' home and where my father was working. At that time he was working in what is East Pakistan, now Bangladesh. And then my education was in both places. Part of the education was in Calcutta, part of the education was in East Pakistan. Both Jesuit schools. I went to Jesuit school. My parents sent me to Jesuit school. They had themselves gone to Jesuit schools. And then my father passed away when I was very young. I was 10, 11 years old. And soon after that, a few years after that, in my teenage years came the breakup of Pakistan in 1971, which was a horrendous civil war, almost a genocidal war. And my family became once again refugees, so to speak. And going back to those years and months is difficult, but it's also now layered with other things that have happened in my life, and I've moved on from it. But if I go back, it is a miraculous circumstances that I was able to escape with my mother and my younger siblings through the killing fields of Bangladesh. Over 1 million people were killed in a matter of 10 months. 10 million people became refugees in India before the civil war ended and Pakistan broke up with Indian government of Mrs. Indira Gandhi taking action. I was able to escape. Some of other members of my family were able to escape. We found our refuge in Calcutta in my grandparents' home, and then from there I came to North America. I came to the States, came to Canada. I had a number of my relatives in Canada who sponsored me, and the Canadian government, given the circumstances that people were going through, acted very swiftly with people who were displaced people like myself, my family. And so I ended up in Canada, been in Canada since early 1974. I went to school in Canada, had to go back again and do my undergraduate years. So I went to school in Canada and then did all my subsequent studies. And here I am. I've been here since early 1990s. London is my home, and I feel very secure and very comfortable, and most importantly, very lucky that I was able to survive that war and was able to find a way out and find a home in this beautiful country.
So Canada must seem quite different to you today than it did when you arrived here in '74. Is it as different as you might think, and what might those differences be philosophically?
Well, I mean, it is in the book I wrote, Delectable Lie. I have touched upon some of that in that book. These almost 40 years, Canada has changed immensely. And a person like me who arrived in Canada barely into my 20, have seen that evolution, have seen that development. And in some sense, there are things to be concerned about and worried about.
Such as?
And in the sense that one worries about, I worry about, is the nature of the Canadian society, Canadian state, as it is evolving in the direction of what has become an official policy, multiculturalism. That it, in many ways, this idea of multiculturalism runs again. When I arrived, and the circumstances in those days, in the early 70s, it was not as invested, that is the idea of multiculturalism, as it has become in this past 40 years. So when I arrived, the strength of Canada was as a liberal democratic society.
Trudeau was president at the time.
Trudeau was prime minister then, and he had initiated
Prime Minister, sorry.
Yes, he was prime, and he had initiated this policy in 1971, 72, if I recall correctly. And so that's the 40 years.
Yes.
But, you know, it takes to grow. And you might say that though he had initiated it, the effects and impacts were minuscule. You know, it was not there, but it has grown. People have invested into it. Institutions have invested into it. It has become a sort of the defining attribute of Canada. And we have shifted away from the idea that Canada is a liberal democracy, which means a whole lot of different things, to the idea that we are a multicultural society, which again means a whole lot of different things.
You wouldn't call multiculturalism as an official policy a part of a liberal democracy? Many would.
Many would, but I don't. And that's the book I wrote, Delectable Lie, that multiculturalism is in fact the most insidious assault on liberal democracy from within. Because it is an assault on the notion of individual freedom in the most fundamental sense. And that's a subject in itself, how and why.
You've called it identity politics.
It is identity politics. It is built upon the idea that is so unusual that nobody else had ever bought at this argument ever before. The idea that all cultures are equal. That is the fundamental principle, a foundational anchor of multiculturalism, that all cultures are equal.
Are they not equal?
And no, cultures are not equal.
Are we talking morally here? In what respect are they not equal?
We might say morally also, but more importantly, objectively. Cultures in terms of what are their achievement, what do they stand for, what do they represent. Cultures are where people have established a way of living over a period of time. It includes the whole aspect of one's society's ideas and values. Religion, the way society works, its history, relationship among people, majority, minority, men and women, and so on and so forth. So, and then the historical achievement of that culture. Japanese culture, Chinese culture, Indian culture, so on and so forth. And if we say that all cultures are equal, we have to then say on what basis are they equal? What is the standard of measurement for that equal? When we say all individuals are equal, all men are born equal, this is both a metaphysical statement, but is also a statement, a philosophical statement that yes, as individuals we are all born equal. We are God's children, those who believe, or in terms of nature. And then the child is educated, is nurtured, and evolves. And then there's the rest of the story. But at the critical point of our birth as human beings, we are all equal. We are God's creation. And then we take on other identities. To say all cultures are equal is to beg the question, what is the criteria by which we judge all cultures equal? Do we judge it on the basis of scientific achievement? Do we judge it on the basis of the philosophical and religious achievement? Arts, music, medicine? What is the basis by which? But to me, the most profound basis by which one might want to judge culture is, which is the culture that accords the greatest respect to freedom, and most importantly to individual freedom, because there is no freedom unless the individual is free. So individual freedom. And the culture that accords the greatest respect to freedom would then stand apart from those cultures which do not.
So what label would you put on that culture? Simply the West?
Well,
America, Britain, Canada?
Well, free societies, I would say. Free cultures. I mean, look, the idea of freedom in the Western world was first took shape 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece, in Athens. We have the first glimmer of people speaking about freedom in the famous speech of Pericles, that is reported by Thucydides in the Peloponnesian War. It's a beautiful speech. It is one of the great iconic speeches that has been recorded by Thucydides and passed on to us. Pericles mentions the characteristic of the Athens that he is defending against Sparta is freedom and democracy, and he proudly stands up to define what he means by that. And then we know what happened. That got eclipsed, that got snipped off, and Greece faded away. For 2,000 years it was gone, till the story again reappears, is reborn in the making of modern Europe and then the modern West. Now, no other culture, as I look around me, have accorded the idea of freedom, individual freedom, as a centerpiece of its identity. Even though, from the point of view of the West, or from the point of view of Judeo-Christian religion, which would include Islam also in the Abrahamic family of religion, the history of man begins, in some sense, with the story of Moses taking his people, the Hebrews or the Jews, out of Egypt, from the Egypt of the Pharaoh, that is out of persecution and oppression, into freedom. That would be the promised land. So that's the beginning of the story, of the historical story. Moses' struggle to free his people. But no other culture, as I look around me, and in my reading and in my thinking, has given the matter of individual freedom the place as the starting point of its identity, as the West came to do, the making of the modern West came to do, the whole struggle that erupted, and you can run it by, Renaissance, Reformation, Counter-Reformation, Enlightenment, all the various revolutions in the making of modern Europe. Of course, the great French Revolution, the very principle liberty stands at the top. Liberty, equality, fraternity, but liberty, individual liberty stands at the top. But the French Revolution is preceded by the American Revolution and the documents of the American Revolution, the ideas of the American Revolution, Jefferson's formulation all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence. And the Constitution designed to protect that declaration, that is the fundamental principle of that declaration. All men are created equal, that is the individual freedom, First Amendment, Second Amendment, and so on, which constitute the Bill of Rights. This is the great experiment that launches the modern world. So if this is the criterion by which we judge cultures and the accomplishments of cultures, then all cultures are not equal, obviously.
And here we are today, though, and some would say we're actually moving backwards in history. Some people would say President Obama, is perhaps one of the worst protectors of the Constitution the United States has ever had. Would you agree with something like that?
Well, when Obama began to run for the office in 2008, and I started looking into his record, I had great suspicion about this man. And the past nearly 4 years have only confirmed those suspicions and made it deeper that Obama is not a man who is dedicated to the idea of American exceptionalism, which means the idea of freedom, which makes America exceptional, and America's history exceptional in the modern world. And Obama does not share that idea with the rest of the Americans. In fact, Obama in some ways stands opposed to that idea, given his own background and his own upbringing and his own teaching and learning and education. And so, yes, I would say that it is one of the great ironies of our time that the freest society, or reputedly the freest society, in principle the freest society, would elect a man like Obama to be its president.
How about Prime Minister Harper here in Canada? What do you see in him? Because I know that even though you talk about the values of a liberal democracy, that's in the classical sense. Aren't you in fact somewhat of a conservative when it comes to politics here in Canada? And if so, how do you see Prime Minister Harper?
Well, I have great respect for Prime Minister Harper. It is interesting, the other day, Rex Murphy, both of us know Rex with his work, wrote a column in the National Post lamenting where are the leaders in the West. People quite rightly have pointed out that maybe we are right now, the time and circumstances in which we are living, we have gone back to the 1930s in some ways. And if we hold to that idea that we are, in a sense, in the 1930s, where there was a leadership vacuum in Europe and the West in the face of the assault on freedom that came from the fascists, the rise of Nazis and Mussolini and so on, and eventually also from the communists, the Bolsheviks, and the absence of leadership, the vacuum that there was in Europe at that time, led to the disaster that we know. That a man like Prime Minister Churchill became Prime Minister, but at that time he was just a front bench member of the Conservative Party in Britain, was in what he called the years of wilderness. Nobody paid him any attention. I see Harper today as one of the very few leaders, if not the only leader in the West, who has taken some very courageous stand on the issues of our time. And the issues of our time since 9/11 is the issue of Islamism. This is the third great totalitarian movement in the world that is threatening not only the West, but most importantly threatening the Muslims themselves. I am a survivor of the genocidal war of people who believe in or who are Islamists. And it is in that context, I think, that Mr. Harper's position that he has taken, for instance, his support for the State of Israel, given the amount of animus and animosity directed in the United Nations among the Europeans, including right here in Canada, among a large segment of the society and in America, is a very courageous stand, in contrast to the position of the liberal leadership, the NDP leadership. And then I see Mr. Harper as one who has demonstrated a deep understanding of the problems in the economic realm, and he has shown a capacity to deal with the challenges that we have been faced with since 2008, the recession of 2008. That Canada and Canada's economy today, judged by all objective standards, by IMF, by World Bank, and other such agencies, by Standard & Poor, by Moody's, is the strongest performing economy among the G8 or the G20. And a lot has to do with Mr. Harper. One has to give the credit where the credit is due.
And not, for example, some of the preceding Liberal prime ministers who actually had budgets with a surplus.
Well, the issue is that 2008, we were hit with a massive recession. Americans had not even yet recovered from it 40 plus months later. And after Obama had poured in over $5 trillion in less than 3 years. If you look at the figure, the debt figure, the GDP, the unemployment figures, Canada is performing much better. And so Mr. Harper's performance during this very troubled time in the world economy has been remarkable. That doesn't take anything away from the previous Liberal administration of Paul Martin and Jacques Chrétien, that during the period 1990s, they worked hard to reduce the deficit, to find a balanced budget. But then again, we have to then put it together in a parliamentary system of democracy, which is ours, that the Liberals also did that under the pressure brought to bear upon them from the Conservative. In those days, the Conservatives were divided. The Conservative Party, after Brian Mulroney, the 1992 election, had collapsed to just 2 members in the House. And the opposition was the Reform Party, which today is the Conservative Party rejoined together. So Mr. Harper was there in the Reform Party as an economic spokesman under the leadership of Preston Manning, and the work of the Reform Party in keeping the pressure on the Liberal government to balance the budget cannot be also taken away from this discussion. It's also part of the equation.
Now, as an academic here in the University of Western Ontario, your ideas, being somewhat conservative, must fly in the face of the general political thought that goes through most universities, which is usually left, if not extreme left, if not Marxist, outright Marxism. Do you find that you are sort of swimming upstream when it comes to your colleagues, your academic colleagues, or even your students? Do they challenge you on your beliefs politically?
Yes, to say no would be disingenuous, so yes, it is. I would say that people of my thinking, we are in the minority, if not a very small minority, in the university environment, and given our values on defense of individual freedom and questioning collectivist ideology from whichever side it comes. And since the left is basically the exponent of collectivist ideology, I find myself that we are in the oppositional role.
How are the students?
Students, I mean, again, they are part of the generation, and they are not alone. This is 3 or 4 generations since the end of Second World War that have basically imbibed the values what you define as the left or left-leaning, center-left values, of which multiculturalism is very much a trademark idea. So the students are carrying the knowledge or the understanding or the thinking within which they have grown up. And so the challenge is for people like us to make them reach back to the classic literature, which predates the literature that has grown around over the last 50, 60 years, to which students have been fed. My favorite book on this matter is Alan Bloom's book, The Closing of the American Mind. And The Closing of the American Mind, one of those rare books given the topic, which was a discussion of political philosophy, became a New York Times bestseller for the entire year when it came out. That was, if my memory serves me right, in 1987. Ronald Reagan was still the president. The Soviet Empire, the evil empire, was still there. And what Alan Bloom was talking about in 1987, he was reflecting back, going all the way back to the end of the war, that is the Second World War, and the way the United States began their drift, was that in the university, the education had turned on the arguments of what is politically correct. And so in pursuit of political correctness, or in remaining true to political correctness, much of the discussion became abridged, cut off, because the great classical writers were not politically correct. They were touching upon the fundamental basic facts of human condition. And the fundamental basic facts of human condition leads you to recognize, to acknowledge, to realize that there is evil in this world, that there are rights and wrong, that there is truth, an objective truth, and not something subjective to the whim and caprice of whoever is saying whatever he wants to say, he or she wants to say. And the closing of the American mind is a closing to the arguments that there is an objective world that can be measured objectively, that there is a historical record. And to go and pick up the arguments of the politically correct, that there is no objective truth. Truth is what passes at this moment. It is all contextual. It is all situational. And that is what has come about over the last 50, 60 years. And that's where the West has been slipping from the perspective of those of us who do believe in objective truth, objective reality, who do believe that there is a moral standard that is not situational, that is not contextual.
Now you've evolved, haven't you, in your political and philosophic beliefs? You were telling me earlier that you studied Marx and Mao to a great degree. Were you a Maoist at one point in time? And if so, how did you change to the person you are today? And what was that kernel of truth that showed you the way from Maoism to your liberal views today?
Well, let me put it in a nutshell. I think, and this is again, it goes back to, I think, George Bernard Shaw's famous statement that if you're not a socialist when you're in your 20s, then you don't have a heart. And if you're not a capitalist, something like that, in your 40s, 50s, or when you're an adult, you don't have a brain. So
it was an intellectual decision to go from matters of what you thought were the heart to today?
What I'm saying is that to be a man of the left is to be a perpetual adolescent, in my view. Because to be a man of the left, that is a man with grievance and resentment and anger against the other for what they have done to oneself, and to hold that as the tool by which we judge history, is to basically cut oneself off from the evolving nature of history of the world, and to hold on to the impressions of resentment and anger, which is so natural when you are young. You grow up, with a beef. And the beef is against everybody. Beef is against your family, against your parents, against the circumstances. This is a natural thing, And the idea of the left that, there are powerful forces that have worked against you to put you in this position is something which comes very naturally without much examination and thought. So, to gravitate towards the left, to read Marx and Lenin and Mao, to hold that view of the world, that the world is divided. That's a Manichaean view, divided between good and evil, in the sense the good is the oppressed people of the world, the people who have been abused, the people who are dispossessed, the people of the third world. I am from the third world, and the evil are, of course, all those people who have done the dispossessing, the oppressing, and cause all the suffering, are the white folks. That is and that's the Europeans, and then of course now the Americans. It's something that if you're born in a place like I was born in Calcutta, you gravitate naturally towards it. And of course I'm a child of the Vietnam War. I came of age during the Vietnam War. And grew up in an environment where China was seen, and Mao Zedong was seen as a great liberator. Mao was alive, and much of the third world, which is now looking back, it's another world. But those who grew up in the 60s and the 70s, much of the third world in Africa, Asia, were heavily influenced by the ideas of the left and Mao Zedong. So how did I come to this position, you're asking? Well, it comes out as a result of experience, of living a life experience, and then questioning one's own thoughts, what one has read, and then going out and looking at the world, testing it, checking it out. I had the good fortune to travel a lot. I traveled through China, been to the former Soviet Union. Of course, I've traveled a lot in the Middle East, North Africa I just come back from. I visited Cuba, Venezuela. I have been, of course, all over India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia. And so you look around, I've been places like Hong Kong, Singapore, cities, and I've been blessed with a life that I'm now in my middle years of my life, middle age, so I can reflect and look back and ask questions. And I came to realize the lies, the bucket full of lies, that is what Maoism and Marxism and Leninism is. And people readily drink into these lies, as I as a youth drank into it, because it looks so attractive, because it gives one quick, ready answer to immense, complex reality of the world.
You must look at the students who are protesting in Quebec for free education, or the youth who are occupying the parks in the major cities in America and in Canada, or the Occupy movement. You must look at them with a little bit of nostalgia, saying that maybe you can understand where they're coming from because you were there at one time.
Yeah, I think that's the latter part, not nostalgia, because I have no desire to go back. But yes,
at least understand.
If I might use the word compassion, and if it is not a wrong word, with compassion, because I believe they're misguided, a whole lot of them. In fact, all of them, I would say, misguided. And they're playing out the role of what a 20-year-old does. The fault lies with their teachers, with the leadership, with the educators, with the political leaders. The fault lies with them. And the fact that we still persist in walking and drinking and slurping and living with those lies tells a lot about us. The Mao, when I was 20 years old and reading him, and I read a lot of Mao. I read almost all of his major writings. And then, of course, as I mentioned, I had a chance to travel through China. But when I was a teenager and I had my copy of the Red Book, and I read his biographies, people like Han Suen and Edgar Snow and others who wrote about him in glorious terms. I bought into those arguments because those arguments were so easy to buy into, because, as I am repeating myself, it gave very simple answer, that the answer lies in the class enemy. And if you identify your class enemy and eliminate your class enemy, you have solved your problem, you know. Well, now we know that this man is responsible for about 100 million people that he killed through the Cultural Revolution and the great leap forward of the 1950s, 1940s, and Cultural Revolution of the 1960s. And that this man was a great mass murderer. The question is, why do we still maintain any aspect of respect for this man?
Or his ideology.
Or for his ideology, or for his government. You know, why is it that some members of our Conservative Party is willing to invest money behind a statue of Norman Bethune? Norman Bethune was a Canadian, but he went and joined Mao Zedong, who was the greatest mass killer of the 20th century, or in all history. And here we are going to celebrate him. Of course, when I came in 1970, I thought Norman Bethune was a great man. But that's part of the learning process. That whatever may have been Norman Bethune's contribution in saving lives of Chinese soldiers in the revolution, the fact is that Norman Bethune was a soldier, and a well-decorated soldier, so to speak, because Mao has written about him, and Mao and his people glorified Bethune, of a movement, of an ideology that has been the greatest killer of Chinese people. How do we reconcile those things?
Who've been your greatest influences along the way, philosophically? Do you have any favorite writers or philosophers who you'd always refer back to as being those people who changed your mind the greatest?
Well, I mean, there's so many. I mean, one's life, and being fortunate to have been an academic, is to spend one's life with writers and books. So there have been so many, and I don't know who I should just pull out. I can say, not facetiously, the Shakespeare, for instance. You know, I just love Shakespeare, and Shakespeare's plays, abiding interest. I go back to them. Poets. Among the Western poets, the English poets, Wordsworth and John Keats are two of my favorite poets. Samuel Taylor Coleridge is another. Among the American poets, Walt Whitman. I just love Whitman's writing, Whitman's idea. And again, he is the poet of freedom, the poet of democracy. If one becomes technical, I think the writings of Karl Popper, Open Society and Its Enemies, Poverty of Historicism, has been very important in my own writing and thinking. Classical liberal writers like Isaiah Berlin, Tocqueville, Lord Acton's essays, John Stuart Mill, most definitely. From my own culture, from my own background, Rabindranath Tagore, the great poet of India, modern India, who was given the Nobel Prize in 1913, the first Asian to win the Nobel Prize in literature. He also happens to be from my city, or I happen to be from his city, which is Calcutta. I grew up in his music, in his poetry, in his writing, and so he has been a very precious part of me. Poets like the 12th, 13th century poet, the great Persian poet Jalaluddin Rumi and Hafiz, they have been very instrumental in my upbringing and in my thinking. Well, you know, I can name names, but if I go back, if something that I would take away with me, you know, I would like to have with me, say, if I was marooned in an island somewhere, I would certainly hope I would have a copy of Shakespeare, a copy of Whitman, a copy of the Rubaiyats of Omar Khayyam, you know, a copy of Rabindranath Tagore's Gitanjali, and I think my day would be quite fine.
If you look at all the students here on campus, or perhaps even for your own children, or what you hear about from the children of today, do you hold out much hope for the liberal democracy you're fighting for?
I think so, absolutely.
Yeah. You're positive about it?
I can't say that I'm overly confident, but again, as a teacher myself, I am by nature optimistic. One of the great joys of being in the university and being a teacher is that one is in regular interaction with the 20-year-old. I think we are the people most privileged to be in the company of the youth. We were once the youth, but we forget, most people forget, of what is youth. But for me, it is to be daily reminded about it as I interact with my students. And it's a sheer joy to interact with them. It doesn't matter where or what background they're coming from or what their thoughts are. They are in the most plastic state of life. They will mold themselves eventually. If they get some indication when they are in the most plastic stage of their life of that which is eternal, of that which is transcendent in terms of beauty. Keats says in his great poem, The Ode to Grecian Urn, he concludes that poem, if I can remember the full line, beauty is truth, truth beauty, this is all you need to know, or something like that. But beauty is truth, truth is beauty. Truth has to be beautiful. Where there is ugliness, there is no truth. The eternal struggle in one sense is between beauty and ugliness, good and evil, beauty and ugliness. The absence of love for beauty means that the inner self is ugly. It is our task as teachers, as leaders, as people in public life, since I write in the public life, and those who are engaged in it, the professional people, people in church, people in mosque, it is to celebrate beauty, to point out beauty in all its facets, because the ultimate is that God is beautiful, those who believe in God. And those who don't believe in God, there is something still that is beautiful that must move them. The picture of the little baby, the first love. Turgenev's book, Ivan Turgenev's wonderful little book, which I treasure, is called First Love. However old one becomes, taking Turgenev here, as he in this little novella he's writing as an old man, he's reflecting that first love is the most treasured moment, that first kiss, that is the beauty, So if you can implant, if you can put in the mind of that young woman, that young man who comes to class, who comes to me, walks into my office, engages with me, if I can leave behind in that mind, awaken in that mind a love for beauty that is eternal, he will be fine, she will be fine. She will discover herself.
Salim Mansur, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you.